We live in a world steeped in incest. A professor of anthropology at Yale University concluded that 80% of marriages throughout human history were incestuous. And this isn't some tired cliche like, everyone's related to everyone. It's far worse. He defined incest as any marriage involving a person within the third degree of kinship or closer. You'd think that for most of history, humanity lived under a strict taboo against close kin incest, but that rule applied only to commoners. Among society's elite, aristocrats, and nobles, incest was a tool for seizing and maintaining power. Hypocrites urged the people to follow the rules and heed the church's teachings, only to go and bear heirs with their own sisters. Today, I'll tell the story of the greatest dynasty of incestuous rulers who staked all their wealth on a real-life Game of Thrones and lost. Their heirs died at birth, and those less lucky suffered for the rest of their lives. And yet, for 200 years, they were the most powerful dynasty in the world. This is the story of the Habsburgs. We'll explore in detail how they managed to subjugate all of Europe, examine how the church used incest as a political weapon, and in the end, through tangled family trees, we'll trace how this intermixing destroyed an entire empire. This episode feels more like a dramatic series than our usual videos, except everything I'm about to tell you really happened. Navigating the 1,000-year history of the Middle Ages isn't easy. To some, it might seem like one massive black hole. And that's understandable. Not all of us are historians. But even within the Middle Ages, there was one century that stood out for its sheer brutality and madness. We're talking about the 14th century, arguably the worst 100 years in human history. What was going on back then? The Crusades were coming to an end. England and France were engaged in a bloody dynastic slaughter that would later be called the 100 Years' War. In the areas that would one day become Italy and Spain, there was no unified state. Italy was a patchwork of principalities and city-states. Spain had already been fighting the Reconquista, the expulsion of Muslims from the peninsula, for 500 years. Looking eastward to what is now Central Europe, you wouldn't find Germany, but instead a towering giant, the Holy Roman Empire. However, behind that image of a giant was a confederation incapable of unity. Hundreds of princes and dukes. This is where most of today's story will take place. Far to the east, Rus was enduring the Mongol-Tatar invasion. That's the 14th century in broad strokes. But zooming in, the cultural and artistic landscape was shifting. Europe was emerging from a long period of stagnation. Dante Alighieri and Petrarch were laying the groundwork for the Renaissance. The world seemed poised for a leap forward. But let's look at the 14th century through the eyes of its contemporaries. For them, it was perhaps the harshest era Europe had seen in 800 years. Just take the Black Death alone. In 7 years, Europe lost between a third and half of its population. Every other person died. Often, there was no one left to bury the dead, and diseases didn't stop the constant warfare. European monarchies had been butchering each other for scraps of land for a millennium. The territory once held by the Roman Empire was still smoldering from barbarian invasions. There was no escape from violence. You could move from northern to southern France, but by trading Orléans for Marseille, you'd only swap English pillagers for the risk of being sold into slavery. The late medieval revival of trade led to a boom in piracy, not just of ships, but of coastal towns themselves. The unluckiest were sold off to North Africa. Now let's run a thought experiment. What would have happened if you were unlucky enough to be born in the 14th century? Most likely, you'd have been born into a peasant family. At the time, 85% of Europeans were rural farmers. Let's say you miraculously survived infancy, avoiding death from the first infection. Maybe the plague missed you, or you survived, but it left your body covered in scars. No one had robbed or murdered you yet. Success, right? But that was just the beginning of your misery. Nature in the 14th century wanted you to suffer. The old warm climate was giving way to a colder one. Snow started falling not just in England or northern Germany, but even in Italy, something unseen in 500 years. During the Great Famine at the beginning of the century, up to a quarter of urban populations died. People believed the end times were near. The Antichrist would soon come, and the world would end. From the 14th to the 19th century, until the Industrial Revolution, peasants didn't live. They survived. I agree, it sounds grim. But let's say you got lucky and were born into a rich and noble family. Forget any idea of a modern 21st century family. You were part of a dynasty. Your personal interests mattered no more than a chamber pot. The family patriarch decided what you'd study, when you'd marry, and your job wasn't to be happy or live in luxury. It was to multiply the family's wealth. Anyone who's seen even a single season of Game of Thrones knows exactly what I mean. From their castles, feudal lords controlled the surrounding villages and collected taxes. It was essentially a form of organized extortion. Peasants paid their lord just so that, if bandits came, someone might protect them. This system could hardly be called a functioning state. Still, the 14th century crushed even the elites. Wars and epidemics killed not only peasants, but knights and noblemen as well. The average lifespan of a European aristocrat dropped from 64 to 45. Many noble houses not only failed to maintain their status, they simply died out. But where there's crisis, there's opportunity. In the scorched landscape called Europe, space began to open up. New families rose to fill the void: Trastamara in Spain, the Ottomans in what is now Turkey, and finally our main characters today, the House of Habsburg in Central Europe. Within just 100 to 150 years, the Habsburgs would go on to rule nearly all of Europe. At the height of their power, both the old and new worlds bowed to them. All of Europe feared going against their will, and all of it was thanks to their strategic mastery of choosing the right husbands and wives. Who were the Habsburgs really, and where did they come from? They were a fairly unremarkable family of landlords from Western Germany. Later, they would craft a grandiose genealogy for themselves, tracing their lineage back to none other than Julius Caesar, or even Aeneas, the mythical founder of Rome. But those were later legends meant to obscure and embellish a truly unimpressive, even pitiful origin. The first real Habsburg, named Guntram the Rich, lived in the 10th century and was notoriously greedy. He not only demanded payments from peasants for using their own land, but also forced them to work his fields. Those who refused were coerced by force. That might sound ordinary, but in the 10th century, serfdom didn't even exist yet. Some believe that Guntram was one of the early architects of the feudal system. He might have kept exploiting peasants indefinitely, but Guntram was not just rich. He was also treacherous. He betrayed the then emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and as punishment, his lands were taken. That should have been the end of the Habsburgs before they even began. But the land wasn't seized for the empire. It was given to his heirs. They built Habsburg Castle, which means Hawk Castle. It still stands today. Look at the photo. It's basically a wonky medieval apartment block. Not exactly what you'd expect from the Great Dynasty. The truth is, they had neither the funds nor the resources to build anything better. So much for Guntram the Rich. The Habsburgs quickly earned a bad reputation. A grim legend tells of one of Guntram's descendants who, despite being married to a noblewoman, decided to amuse himself. He seduced the daughter of a town artisan, promised her a happy future, and left her pregnant. When she came to demand he keep his word, he threw her in a dungeon, where she starved to death. As she died, she cursed the Habsburgs to a horrible fate. But this curse clearly had a delayed start function, like on modern washing machines. The dynasty didn't die out. In fact, it only grew stronger. The Habsburgs developed a highly effective strategy. They knew they couldn't rely on military power, lacking both money and resources. So they pursued two paths. First, they became ideal courtiers, currying favor with the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire to be granted land in exchange for loyal service. But this required hard work and risk. Failure could mean death. The second option was easier and more pleasant. They scoured Germany like elite matchmaking agencies, searching for wealthy, noble heiresses to marry. The dowries, usually land, were substantial. This was the core of their strategy. The Habsburgs viewed marriage not as an act of love or spiritual union, but as cold calculation for political and financial gain. Such cynicism was common among the feudal class of the era. But the Habsburgs were in a league of their own. The true master of this strategy was Rudolf I, Under him, the dynasty secured what would become their hereditary stronghold for centuries, Austria. He wasn't a pleasant man. When a neighboring count insulted him, Rudolf retaliated by marching into his lands, burning everything in sight, bribing the guards, storming the castle, and personally killing his enemy. Still, Rudolf's defining traits as a Habsburg were on display at court and in bed. He married a wealthy countess, which opened the doors to the imperial elite, killing two birds with one stone. Then he cozied up to the emperor with flattery, gifts, and displays of loyalty. When a bishop rebelled against the emperor, Rudolf led a night raid into his lands and burned down a convent with the nuns still inside. Sounds like a monster, someone who deserved divine punishment, but life had no interest in punishing him. When the emperor died, it was Rudolf who became his successor. In the Holy Roman Empire, the position of emperor was elected. To take the throne, you needed the support of the prince-electors. Rudolf had no trouble securing that. One elector was his brother-in-law. Two others were bribed through marriage deals. He had 11 children, so arranging advantageous marriages wasn't hard. In 1273, Rudolf Habsburg reached an unimaginable height. From a mere feudal lord, he became emperor through cunning alone. Thanks to ruthlessness, pragmatism, and sharp negotiation skills, the Habsburgs rose from the mud to the throne. Everyone was driven by the thirst for power, but only the Habsburgs turned it into a full-blown hereditary obsession. Times would change, but their ambitions remained the same. They continued to strengthen their position, forge marriages, and occasionally wage successful wars. And just like that, we find ourselves in the early 16th century. The world looks very different than it did 200 years before. America was now being colonized by Europeans. The Renaissance, which began in the 14th century, had blossomed, dragging culture, science, and technology into the modern era. It was the age of empires. The Russian Tsardom was forming, Bourbon France was emerging as a continental power, and the Ottoman Empire was pushing deep into Europe from the Balkans, only to meet a rival it would never defeat, the Habsburgs. Over 200 years, through strategic marriages, this feudal dynasty had seized control of Austria, Bohemia, Hungary, and even parts of northern Italy and the Benelux. Smart marriage alliances had made them masters of Europe. But even that wasn't enough. The territories of the Holy Roman Empire didn't satisfy them. The Habsburgs dreamed of becoming monarchs of the entire Christian world. Just look at their mottos. One was a Latin acronym meaning, Austria is destined to rule the world. Another offered instructions. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. For Mars grants others glory, but Venus grants you kingdoms. But with wealth and power came paranoia and fear of losing it all. The Habsburgs worried that one day a marriage alliance with the wrong neighbor might backfire. So they began to turn inward and embrace the ultimate strategy for keeping power in the family: incest. In 1820, a Christian missionary arrived in Hawaii. What he saw there shocked him. The local ruling families not only tolerated, but openly encouraged incest. Rulers married not just cousins, but even their own sisters. The degree of kinship didn't matter at all. Most peoples of the world have restrictions against incest. These developed through the lived experience of humanity as a species. No one needed 20th century genetic research to realize the obvious. Children born from close kin unions were often unhealthy. Over time, this logic took on the form of tradition and religious prohibition, but that wasn't the case everywhere. For example, in ancient Egypt, incest within the pharaoh's family wasn't just accepted, it was considered natural. If the pharaoh was a god on earth, he shouldn't mix his blood with that of mere mortals. Many have heard of Queen Nefertiti, but few remember who her husband was. Most likely she was married to her brother Akhenaten. Their union produced the owner of the most beautiful sarcophagus in history, Tutankhamun. But Tutankhamun wasn't so much a man as a walking encyclopedia of genetic disorders. The young pharaoh couldn't walk without a cane, had necrosis in the bones of both feet, and was club-footed. To turn his head, he had to rotate his whole torso, and his face bore a cleft palate. He looked something like this, and frankly resembled a god only in the most distant sense. Unsurprisingly, he died at 19 and left no heirs. He tried, but his union with his sister resulted in 2 stillborn children. You'd think people would learn from such tragedies. but the belief in the purity of royal blood was stronger. Even the famous Cleopatra, who lived 1,500 years after Tutankhamun, married two of her brothers, in succession, of course. Meanwhile, in Europe, the tradition of incest never took root. Incest was taboo long before the time of Christ. This was most vividly expressed in the Greek myth of Oedipus, who unknowingly married his own mother. The gods punished his people with a terrible plague, and he gouged out his own eyes upon learning the truth. Even unintentional incest was seen as a grave sin. The Romans also viewed incest with disgust. Marriage between relatives was a criminal offense. Incest became associated with some of the most hated emperors in Roman history, Caligula and Nero. And this is where a turning point occurs. Christianity enters the stage. Early Christians were considered radicals by surrounding society. They rejected neighboring traditions, refused to accept foreign gods, and openly declared that others worshiped nonsense. To them, Roman morals seemed sinful and depraved. Naturally, incest was condemned by Christians too. Yet even in their enemies, they acknowledged some shared moral codes. St. Augustine wrote that even pagans strove to avoid incest. Speaking of Christianity, many atheists often smirk and ask, what about Adam and Eve's children? How did they avoid incest? Christian theologians never tried to dodge the question or invent clever loopholes. Augustine stated plainly, yes, Cain and Abel married their sisters, but once the population grew, the practice was forbidden, clear and firm. Let's return to the Middle Ages. Unlike other churches, the Catholic Church actively used its stance on incest for political gain. In the 8th century, power in Europe lay with the kings of former barbarian states. The church was weak, merely a tool of the ruling elite. Even the Pope was a nobody compared to a king or duke. This didn't sit well with church authorities. To strengthen its influence, the Catholic Church chose incest as its political weapon. It assumed the crucial role of defining what did and did not count as incest. Previously, incest referred only to relationships with close and first cousins, but the Church expanded the definition to include second cousins. Marrying a stepmother or a brother's ex-wife also became sinful. By the end of the century, even godparents were off limits. Thanks to the Church, incest became a violation, not just of blood ties, but of spiritual ones too. And these were not rules you could ignore. Wealthy or influential people were excommunicated for incest. Commoners could be executed. These rules persisted well into the 16th century. Remember Henry VIII and his 6 wives? He got rid of his second wife by accusing her of incest with her brother. The charge was false, but that didn't stop him from having both beheaded. The circle of forbidden relationships kept expanding. Rulers often struggled to determine whether their next marriage would be considered sinful. After all, aristocratic bloodlines were deeply intertwined. That's where the church stepped in. It became mandatory to review the couple's genealogies before marriage and rule whether it was permissible. The church now wielded a tool of immense power. It could find reasons to ban almost any marriage, or look the other way when needed. People started to listen. Papal authority, strong enough to bring emperors to heel, was born through incest. The new marriage laws had an unexpected side effect: the rise of European individualism. According to recent research, as church prohibitions strengthened, people could no longer marry within their small communities. They had to seek partners elsewhere. This weakened large family clans and community bonds, which had once tolerated incest. In their place, personal identity and individuality gained importance. But prohibitions are one thing. By the 14th century, Europe's upper classes were beginning to reverse course. Remember the plague we mentioned earlier? It didn't just kill off half the continent. People had already figured out that isolation helped prevent illness. Aristocrats too isolated themselves, and locked away, they began to stare at the ceiling and ignore church rules. Better to marry a relative living in your castle than die of plague searching for the love of your life. Among the elite, incest became fashionable. In 1496, an event occurred that would change the fate of an entire dynasty. The heir to the Austrian house, Philip the Handsome, married a young Spanish woman, Joanna of Castile. Through her, the Habsburgs aimed to lay claim to the Spanish crown. Joanna came from an extraordinarily complicated family, even by aristocratic standards. Her parents were third cousins, and although this didn't affect her physical health, the real issues ran deeper: in her mind. When she first laid eyes on her betrothed, she fell head over heels in love, and to be fair, Philip was considered a strikingly handsome man. Every lady at court dreamed of being in his arms. He took full advantage of this. Even at his own wedding, Philip focused more on Joanna's ladies-in-waiting than on his bride. He behaved like a typical Habsburg. To him, marriage was purely a political transaction. Loving Joanna for life was never part of the plan. His only true love was the Spanish throne. All 6 of their children were born with that single goal in mind, and that's when Joanna began to unravel. She became wildly jealous, refusing to leave Philip's side. In a fit of rage, she once attacked a rival, cut off her hair, and slashed her face with scissors. When Philip realized his wife was slowly losing her mind, he fled from Spain, which he despised. Joanna took it hard and plunged into a deep depression. She stopped eating and refused to bathe for months. Eventually, her parents allowed her to travel to reunite with her husband. It should have helped. Instead, it only made things worse. In the presence of the object of her obsession, her madness intensified. She began cutting pieces from his clothes to keep as mementos and assaulted any woman who came near him. During their arguments, she would threaten him with hunger strikes. Then the inevitable happened. Her mother, the queen, died, making Joanna the new monarch, though under her father's regency. A brutal power struggle broke out between her husband and her father, full of intrigue and manipulation. It might have dragged on, but Philip contracted smallpox and died within days. If Joanna had only been mentally unstable before, now her genetic inheritance came crashing down full force. From that moment on, she was known only as Joanna the Mad. She refused to bury her husband. Instead, she spent her days staring at his body. To prevent his decay, he was embalmed in honey. Think that's the worst of it? Joanna embarked on a journey with her husband's corpse. They traveled across Spain, and she would speak to Philip's body about the local sites. The procession consisted only of men. Joanna didn't allow any women near his remains. The coach carrying the body moved only at night. Joanna feared crowds. Oh, and by the way, Joanna was in the final trimester of pregnancy during this voyage. After several years of this, everyone around her began to lose patience, especially her children. Her son, now King Charles of Spain, visited her and was horrified by her condition. Things had only gotten worse. She no longer bathed and ate nothing but bread. Most tragically, her young daughter had been by her side this whole time. No one could take the girl from Joanna. She was the last living reminder of her beloved Philip. In the end, Charles saw no better option than to confine his mother to a house. But rescuing his younger sister from a mentally ill woman proved impossible. The girl would only see the outside world 9 years later, on her wedding day, when she was married off to the King of Portugal. As for Joanna, she would live out the next 39 years in isolation, dying at the age of 75. Joanna's fate would become a grim omen of the Habsburg dynasty's downfall. While Joanna remained in her forced voluntary confinement, the Habsburg Empire reached its peak. By 1533, Joanna's son, Charles I, ruled half of Europe. In his hands were Austria, Spain, Bohemia, the Netherlands, most of Italy, and vast territories in the New World. He was so powerful that a Christian empire under Habsburg rule seemed inevitable. In the 20th century, after World War II, Charles's political vision was seen as a prototype of a united Europe, and he was even dubbed the father of the European Union. To his contemporaries, Charles was awe-inspiring. Some feared him, others held him in deep respect. Open enemies were rare. Charles ensured that by sending opponents to the executioner's block. Yet his greatest adversary wasn't a politician, but a theologian, Martin Luther, with his 95 Theses. Luther's rejection of Catholic dogma put an end to the dream of uniting Europe under a single Catholic monarch. Charles never succeeded in crushing the Protestant movement. He also struggled with family genetics. Not in terms of mental or physical illness, he avoided that fate. But he did have a very peculiar appearance. One envoy described his face as a long, cadaverous mask with a crooked mouth that hung open when he wasn't paying attention. His most prominent feature was the infamous Habsburg jaw. It was so noticeable that during a trip through Spain, a peasant once shouted, "Your Majesty, close your mouth. The flies here are quite bold." But what worried Charles more than his jaw was the preservation and expansion of the Habsburg domains. Looking back at his mother's family history, he drew a conclusion, though it turned out to be entirely wrong. Charles set an unwritten rule: Habsburgs should marry other Habsburgs, and he led by example. His wife was his first cousin. Of their 8 children, only 3 survived to adulthood, 2 daughters and 1 son. And so began another round of the Game of Thrones. How to marry off the children for maximum political gain. The 2 daughters married their own cousins, and the sole son, Philip II, was destined for an especially dramatic path. Philip II inherited from his father not only the signature Habsburg looks and sharp mind, but also an unshakable belief in the Catholic Habsburg Empire. He became the founder of the Spanish branch of the dynasty. The German and Austrian territories went to his uncle Ferdinand, while Philip expanded his empire by acquiring neighboring Portugal. As with most Habsburg gains, this too came through marriage. But Philip had no one to pass the empire on to. His first wife, predictably, was his cousin Maria. The marriage was doomed. She died at 17 during childbirth. Their son survived but was mentally and physically unwell. He was violently aggressive and, in the end, plotted an assassination attempt against his own father. The outcome was grim. By the age of 23, the heir to the throne had died in his father's prison. One marriage down. Moving on. Philip's second wife was none other than Queen Mary of England, known to history as Bloody Mary. She was 12 years older than Philip, but fell madly in love with him. Philip, much like his handsome grandfather, only loved power. Had their union produced heirs, England might have been absorbed into the Habsburg Empire. But fate had other plans. In 1557, a mysterious fever swept through England. Its symptoms were so strange that even today, no one knows what the illness was. It mostly claimed the lives of urban dwellers and aristocrats, Queen Mary among them. Another failed marriage. Philip didn't dwell on it. He had already lined up a third wife, Elizabeth of France. However, he didn't bother to attend the wedding. A trusted representative stood in for him at the altar. Apparently, that was allowed. Surprisingly, this marriage turned out well. Philip genuinely loved Elizabeth, but the problem remained. They had 4 daughters and no son. Without a male heir, the Habsburg theory of power began to fall apart. The pressure proved too much for Elizabeth. She died giving birth to their 5th daughter. Still no heir. Philip was running out of time. Without a son, the centuries-old empire built by his ancestors would begin to crumble. And then he remembered there was still one surviving male heir, born of his cousin. Incest once again came to the rescue. He quickly married his cousin's daughter, his own niece. Finally, on the 11th attempt and in his 4th incestuous marriage, a son was born, Philip III, the future King of Spain. The Habsburgs had secured the Spanish throne once and for all, but only thanks to close kin marriages. Marriages between cousins became the calling card of the Spanish Habsburgs, a practice soon adopted by monarchies across Europe. For centuries, aristocrats, especially kings, often married women of lower status. But by the 16th century, feudalism was in its final days. Everything became the property of the monarch, even the state itself. In this context, the very idea of marrying someone of lesser status became absurd. Who are they compared to us? Thus began the operation of the international blue blood bride exchange. But the Habsburgs had different priorities. They weren't just interested in marrying equals. They were interested in preserving power. Attentive viewers might ask, didn't the church, the very one that had fought incest for centuries, do anything about this madness? Yes, more or less, it simply watched. Let's not forget who the Habsburgs were. They were the greatest family in the world, and the era of the church's overwhelming authority was already fading. If needed, the Habsburgs could just have a word with the Pope. Charles I once did just that. He sacked Rome, set the city on fire, and up to 50,000 civilians died. And yet, even after such a spectacle, the Habsburgs still had the reputation of being defenders of the Catholic Church. In its struggle against Protestantism, the Catholic Church needed the Habsburgs, and so it kept turning a blind eye to their sexual peculiarities. Every Habsburg marriage was accompanied by a special document from the Pope called a dispensation. This allowed them to legally bypass the Church's restrictions on incest. In other words, incest, at least in this specific case, was officially sanctioned by the Catholic Church. But that was just internal Habsburg affairs. Elsewhere in Europe, things were getting just as interesting. Essentially, the ruling houses of Europe were merging into one global-scale dynasty. Just look at the famous photo of Russia's Tsar Nicholas II with his cousins, George V of Britain and Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. The resemblance between them wasn't a coincidence, but the result of a long genetic process. Anyone who refused to play by these rules was removed from the line of succession. Eventually, Nicholas's son, Tsarevich Alexei, became a direct victim of close kin marriage. His condition, hemophilia, a disorder that prevents blood from clotting, was a common genetic defect circulating among Europe's royal families, and it ultimately brought the mystic Grigory Rasputin into the heart of the Russian court. It's hard to imagine incest on the scale of the European royal family system, but the fact remains, incest decisively conquered the aristocracy. Even Queen Elizabeth II, in essence, was married to her third cousin, a Greek prince. All European monarchs were connected by blood, but that didn't lead to their collapse. There were simply too many different genes in that enormous super dynasty. The Habsburgs weren't so lucky. Incest finished off their great house once and for all. By the mid-17th century, Spain was no longer the mighty empire it once was. In the age of the great geographical discoveries, the country had entered history with its head held high and hopes for a glorious future. But 150 years later, not a trace of that optimism remained. Spain was poor, unable to manage its vast wealth in the New World. Instead of investing in industry, the Spanish Habsburgs squandered it all on war and art. Sure, you can still admire the paintings and statues in Madrid's Prado Museum today, but war only drained money and offered almost nothing in return. The 30 Years' War, the conflicts for control over Italy, the attempts to crush the English kingdom, all of it devoured tons of gold and silver, ultimately resulting in lost territories and diminished prestige. The dynasty that could pull gold from 1,000 American mines became Europe's largest debtor, and the Habsburgs kept sinking into the abyss of incest. Over nearly 2 centuries, the Spanish throne became so saturated with inbreeding that there wasn't a single healthy spot left in their gene pool. Of the 11 royal marriages in the Spanish Habsburg branch, 9 failed the test for consanguinity. Eventually, infant mortality among the Spanish Habsburgs was 50% higher than that of common village peasants, despite having the best doctors in the world at their disposal. And the cherry on top, the last Habsburg to sit on the Spanish throne, Charles II, grandson of Philip III, and the great-great-great-grandson of Joanna the Mad. This man had it worse than anyone. To put it in perspective, in a typical 5-generation family tree, you would expect 32 ancestors. Charles had only 10. Let that sink in. His father was his mother's uncle. His mother was the product of a marriage between first cousins who themselves were born from incestuous unions. Sounds like a twisted logic puzzle, but it was just one Habsburg family tree. Charles II was simply born with a catastrophic hand. His father and grandfather may not have been brilliant, but they were mentally and physically sound. Poor Charles never had that chance. In the Game of Thrones universe, the Targaryen family believed that each new child was a coin toss, a genius or a madman. In reality, the odds were even worse: mediocrity or total dysfunction. Looking at portraits of Charles II won't reveal much. Artists knew how to paint what the royals wanted to see. But his real life was far more horrifying. Contemporaries described him as small, frail, awkwardly built, with an unattractive face. He couldn't walk without holding onto a wall, a table, or someone else. As weak in body as he was in mind. Occasionally, he showed signs of intelligence, memory, or energy. But most of the time, he was apathetic, sluggish, and seemed dim-witted. You could do anything with him because he had no will of his own. A fitting summary. Now the details. The old Habsburg trait, his protruding lower jaw, was no longer just a cosmetic issue. Charles couldn't even eat properly because his jaws didn't close. He suffered from everything his cursed lineage could deliver. epilepsy, bone deformities, impotence, daily fainting spells, and hallucinations. Ultimately, he was intellectually disabled. He didn't learn to speak until age 4, nor to walk until age 8. No one even tried to teach him science. Everyone knew it was pointless. Charles learned the basics of court etiquette so he could appear dignified, and that was about it. Doctors tried to treat him, but by today's standards, nothing could have helped. In the 17th century, however, they still believed. One of the most popular treatments for the young king? Exorcisms. Unsurprisingly, they didn't work. Despite his monstrous medical chart, they still tried to get an heir out of him. His first wife was a French princess. Imagine her disappointment. Raised to be the perfect queen and mother for one of Europe's greatest monarchs, only to marry this poor creature who spent all his time playing with dwarfs. The court hated her too. Relations between France and Spain were tense. The queen fell into deep depression. Unable to have children, she sought comfort in food. In February 1809, after a walk, she complained of stomach pain. The next day, she died. Rumors said she was poisoned by her own mother-in-law. Charles was quickly married off again. His second wife, Anna Maria of Neuburg, was said to be extraordinarily beautiful, but also arrogant, selfish, and not very bright. After the death of his first wife, Charles showed no interest in anything anymore. At their wedding, he barely acknowledged his new bride. He was far more focused on the cakes, which he devoured with gusto. As Charles slowly faded, two women battled for the throne behind the scenes. Anna Maria, knowing they'd never produce an heir, campaigned to pass the crown to her nephew, a Habsburg from the Austrian branch. She was opposed by her mother-in-law, who had also despised Charles's previous wife. While these women clashed, the king steadily declined. Charles II died at age 38. Not bad considering his condition. With his death, the male line of the Spanish Habsburgs came to an end. The greatest fear of Charles the Martyr had come true. The Habsburgs had lost Spain. Incest, once used as a tool to retain power, had now ensured its collapse. Despite 5 to 6 childbirths per queen, only about half of the children survived the first year, and the lucky ones carried too many repeated genes to live normally. The Spanish line was finished, but the Habsburgs hadn't died out. One branch remained, the Austrian line, and they were preparing to reclaim the Spanish crown. But now they had competition. Even while Charles II was still alive, a fierce battle was already unfolding over the Spanish throne. Two main contenders emerged. The first and most obvious were the Austrian Habsburgs. Charles had a sister who had married her uncle, but she tragically died at a young age. This left the Austrian Habsburg claim hanging in the balance. The second player was the French Bourbon dynasty, which had strong ties to its Spanish neighbors. Charles's first wife had come from this very family. Envoys from both Austria and France regularly arrived at the feeble king's court. The Austrians came first, presenting documents transferring the succession to their house. Charles, in his mental state, signed them without hesitation. Later, the French arrived with a similar proposal, and Charles signed that too. It was this coincidence that the Bourbon claim was the last one he signed that gave them a legitimate right to the Spanish throne. A few months later, Charles died, and the following year, a new king from the French Bourbon dynasty was crowned, Philip V of Spain, and then war broke out. I won't go into detail about the War of the Spanish Succession. That's not what this video is about. But I'll say this, it was the true Zero World War. Fighting took place not only in Europe, but also in the New World. The French, Spanish, and a dozen smaller nations clashed with the combined forces of Austria, Prussia, England, the Netherlands, and many minor allies. Up to 1 million people died, and it all began with incest. In the end, the Spanish throne went to the Bourbons. Their monarchs still rule Spain to this day. But what happened during the war in Habsburg, Austria, is even more fascinating. Despite the fact that their genetic pool was less damaged by inbreeding than their Spanish cousins, it didn't save them. Just 40 years after Charles II's death, in 1740, the last male Habsburg died. The great dynasty that once dreamed of ruling the world had come to an end. The curse of that young pregnant girl, spoken all the way back in the 10th century, had finally come true. Now some sharp-eyed viewers might ask, but didn't the Habsburgs continue ruling Austria? Who got overthrown after World War I then? The answer lies in the name. The later Habsburgs were technically called the Habsburg-Lorraines. Here's why. The last emperor of the original Habsburg line, Charles VI, passed a law that allowed his daughter, Maria Theresa, to inherit the throne. She became the mother of the next generation of Habsburgs. But dynasties are named after the male line, and her husband was the Duke of Lorraine. To preserve status and prestige, the two houses merged under the name Habsburg-Lorraine. For simplicity, they were and still are referred to as Habsburgs, but in essence it was, as they say, a different legal entity. When we think of incest as something distant and barbaric, we're mistaken. According to research, even today, over 10% of marriages worldwide occur between first or second cousins. These unions are becoming less common, but it's clear that humanity won't entirely abandon the tradition, no matter the prohibitions. Ultimately, the history of incest is the history of monarchy and aristocracy. When we open a history book and read about past kings, we rarely stop to wonder, who were their parents and how were they related? History is far more complex than it appears at first glance. It hides countless secrets, many we'd rather not even think about. But let's not deny the obvious. Without incest, our world and the map of modern Europe would look very, very different. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share it with your friends. See you soon.